Hello, and welcome back to That AuDHD Teacher. I'm Emily, an early childhood teacher, late diagnosed ADHD, and someone who spent a lot of time trying to understand why my brain works the way it does. Today's episode is one I actually wish I had when I started wondering whether I might be autistic or ADHD. Because somewhere along the journey, you start kind of thinking, okay, this sounds a little bit familiar. You start watching videos, you read posts, you listen to podcasts, you take some online quizzes, maybe some books, and you're kind of sitting there and you're like, wait, could I actually be autistic, or could I have ADHD, or could I have both? And then what? I feel like that's the part that can be really confusing. There is so much information online now, which is amazing, but it can also be really overwhelming to know what to do. So today's episode is going to be a little bit of a practical one. If you're wondering whether you might have ADHD or you might be autistic or both, remembering there are a lot of different diagnoses that do come under the neurodivergent umbrella, not just these two, but I have experience with these two. So we'll be talking about some online screening questionnaires, what they can and can't tell you, things you can start noticing in your own life through childhood and adulthood, what kind of evidence might be useful, books and resources that I find useful, and how you might actually go about getting an assessment. I do want to make one thing really, really clear. This isn't me telling you that you are autistic or have ADHD. I am not a psychologist. I am not a medical professional. And this is not a diagnostic episode. I'm simply sharing and talking about the things that helped me investigate my own experiences and the things that I think are useful to know if you're at this stage of wondering. Because I definitely remember how confusing that stage was. So if you're currently there, I totally, totally get it. And obviously, when I got to this point, I was like 3 years down the track of researching and kind of pondering it in the back of my mind. And I did eventually get to a point where I'd done so much research and reflecting that I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure this is what it is. I was still very nervous that I was going to get laughed out of the room, but I was pretty sure that this was accurate. So I guess the first piece of advice that I have is you absolutely don't need to figure it all out at once. You don't need to automatically decide, okay, this is it, I'm autistic. I think there's just so many things going on in life that you can just be curious about it, if that makes sense. You don't necessarily need to say, okay, I'm just going to prove that I'm autistic. I think it just starts with noticing some things about yourself and aiming to understand them better. And I think it's really important not to get stuck on one particular diagnosis, because if you're so convinced that you must have this diagnosis, it's really disappointing when it turns out to be something else. And I think it's very easy to start looking at things through that one lens. So you just want to be really, really curious about your experiences instead of right away starting to collect evidence for that conclusion that you have already reached, if that makes sense. I think one of the first things to do is start paying attention to what's actually happening in your life and start noticing the patterns. So it's not a matter of, oh, I relate to this TikTok video. It's what actually happens to me. What situations am I finding difficult? What situations are easy? What takes me a huge amount of energy? Looking for the things that you struggle with consistently. Maybe the things that seem effortless for other people, but they're really, really exhausting for you. Noticing things like what happens when your routine changes and when you're overwhelmed. Looking at what happens in social situations, work and home, and what happens when nobody is watching. I think that one is really important because sometimes we become so used to compensating that we don't even realize how much effort something takes. And it's not until we think about it that we actually realize, like, you might think you're really good socially, but you're not even noticing that you're spending your entire drive home replaying conversations, or your entire drive there coming up with social scripts to say, you know? And I just think those are the sorts of patterns that we need to start paying attention to. So that's one of the first things I would recommend. And I wouldn't only focus on the things that you struggle with. I think it's also important to notice what your strengths are, because being neurodivergent isn't just a list of deficits. You could have really awesome strengths, like having an incredible memory for things you're interested in. You might be able to focus for hours on something you're really, really passionate about. Maybe you're super creative, or you're able to notice lots of attention to detail that other people might miss. Maybe you have a super strong sense of justice, or you're really empathetic. Those things are just as important because you're trying to understand yourself as a whole person, and it's not just collecting a list of evidence of everything that's supposedly wrong with you. I also think the next thing you might want to do is try some screening questionnaires. There are so many of these that can be found online, but please remember that a screening questionnaire is not a diagnosis. It's really just a screening tool. And for ADHD, one really commonly used adult screening tool is the Adult ADHD Self-Report Scale, or the ASRS. I'll put the link for this in the episode of the podcast as well if you'd like to find it. It's basically an 18-item questionnaire for adults with 6 questions in part A that are really useful for screening. So the results of the screening tool typically suggest that you may have ADHD, and that's really useful to then take to your healthcare professional, but you shouldn't use this one screening tool to diagnose it yourself. It's more like if you score highly on the screening questionnaire, you can take it and discuss it with your GP and talk about whether this might be something that you'd like to look into more. I just want to make it really clear that just because you score highly in a screening test, it doesn't mean that you definitely have ADHD, because there are a lot of other things that it could be as well. And that's why it's really important to talk to a health professional. I know that diagnostic assessments are very expensive, and therefore there are a lot of people who can't access them. And I know that there is a lot of discussion around self-diagnosis, and there are sort of two different sides to this. But it is always worth discussing with a health professional if you can, anyway, even if you're only able to take it to your GP at this stage. It's also worth noting here that it does depend what country you're in, because here in New Zealand, they do not diagnose adult ADHD through the public health system. They have opened it up to GPs, but it is still very expensive depending on where you are. There are a few different options. You could get diagnosed by a clinical psychologist instead of a psychiatrist. But then if you were wanting to get meds for ADHD, for example, you would have to then go to a psychiatrist, which is extra money again. So it really just depends. I know that the public health system does a bit of autism diagnosis, but it definitely is quite hard to get one through the public health system as an adult. But I think the best place to start is your GP. I have heard a lot of horror stories about the GP. I think that there are some medical professionals out there that still haven't caught up to the latest research. And I have heard that medical professionals have said to people, you can't have ADHD because you were able to go to university, for example. So if you take this information to your GP and they really invalidate it, I honestly would take it to another health professional, because I don't think that everyone out there is going to understand. And I think at the very least, you deserve to be listened to about that. So all of what I've said about screening questionnaires applies to the autism ones as well. And again, there are lots of different tools you can find online. I will link the AQ screening questionnaire in the podcast description, so you can use that if you like. But there are lots of different online tools you can find. You can just Google it and it will pop up. Some of them are more detailed than others. It really just depends what stage you're at and what you like in a questionnaire. So really easy to be found online, and they're really useful for helping you think about your experiences and maybe giving you questions that you hadn't considered before as well. And then that can sometimes help you decide whether you do want to investigate further. But again, not a diagnosis. Another thing about the online questionnaire is to save your results at the end, so you can actually take that to your medical professional instead of just doing it and then closing it. Being able to save it however you're able. If you need to screenshot it, or if you're actually able to download it and save it, I would do that. You never know, because that information could become useful to you later. And something I just want to emphasize here is that we don't need to just focus on our score. I think the biggest thing we can actually focus on is kind of those aha moments where you're like, oh my goodness, I do that all the time, or I never thought about this before, or oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. Those are the questions that will actually help you investigate it further instead of how high a score you got on the screening tool. The next thing I would recommend is to do some reading. Obviously, there is a lot online and not all of it is going to be good. There are so many rabbit holes you can go down, and you don't want to end up going down the wrong rabbit holes. So I definitely recommend just choosing a few, but really good quality readings rather than trying to read everything. If you are looking for information specific to your country, I would Google the best place to start with that. In New Zealand, Autism New Zealand is a great place to start, and it has specific support to Aotearoa as well as Altogether Autism. That's another really good Aotearoa specific website you can use. In Australia, there's a really awesome website called Reframing Autism. And even if you're not based in Australia, it has tons of articles. And most of the content on that website is written by autistic people themselves. So you're getting really reliable information. So those sorts of websites are a really good place to start. From there, you can move on to books and some lived experience resources. In New Zealand, there is ADHD New Zealand that you can look at, as well as the Healthify website has information on both autism and ADHD and the assessment processes and things like that. If you're not sure, I would just Google your country and see if you have any kind of national autism or ADHD kind of society, because most countries will have one and it sort of compiles a lot of information that you need. And then from there, you can move on to books or lived experiences as well. Now, I am not good at reading and I'm not good at listening either, but I found that if I was driving, I was able to concentrate. So I really love audiobooks for this. There are so many audiobooks out there about people's lived experience, but one of the books I really loved for late diagnosed women in particular, that book is Women and Girls on the Autism Spectrum by Sarah Hendrickx. I will also leave these details in the podcast caption so you don't have to try and scramble and find them later. There was a lot of research weaved in there. I did find it hard to get into, but once I was into it, I loved it. A really common one you'll hear people talk about is Unmasking Autism by Devon Price. I also just finished We're All Neurodiverse by Sonny Wise, which was amazing. Another one that I really loved was Different, Not Less by Chloe Hayden. She's an Australian author. And then there's also Welcome to AuDHD. If you're sort of looking for both, it's really nice to have it framed in one book. And another one is AuDHD by Leanne Maskell. As I've said in other podcast episodes, I am a lot more comfortable with the autistic side rather than the ADHD. And that is because I've done a lot more research and a lot more reading about it. So you will notice that my recommendations are very autistic heavy, but that's just because that's what I'm confident in recommending. There are some good ADHD books out there as well. In New Zealand, there is an author who has written a series of books. She's done one on dyslexia, ADHD, and autism, I believe. She's made them as journals for young adults, but I found it incredibly useful as an adult who doesn't like reading because it's pretty much a page per topic. So you can flick through at any pace. You don't have to go in order. You can go back and forth. And it was just little bite-sized information that I found really easy to understand. But there are so many books out there. I think a lot of people are coming out with their own lived experiences, which is really amazing. But I would just be careful not to treat one book as the definitive explanation of either autism or ADHD. I would recommend that you read widely and just noticing what resonates with you, because not everything you are going to relate to. Everyone's experience is unique and no one is going to be identical. So if you relate to some things and not to others, that's okay. The next thing I would recommend you do is look backwards. So, what I mean by that is looking at your childhood. Because if you're an adult and you're wondering if you might have ADHD or autism, and you look at your current life, you might wonder if you were always like that. And maybe you weren't exactly the same. But neurodevelopmental conditions aren't something that suddenly appear when you're age 29 years old. They're developmental. So we need to start thinking about what we were like as a child, which can be really difficult because we probably don't remember. And for ADHDers, it's also really, really common to have blocked out parts of our lives. So we might not even have any memory of that. And I think this is where family and childhood friends become a really awesome resource because those are people that knew you when you were growing up. So if you can ask your parents or your siblings, grandparents, aunties, uncles, family friends, if you had any childhood friends growing up, basically anyone who knew you well when you were young, ask them questions. And I wouldn't go straight into, do you think I'm autistic? Because that just introduces a whole lot of bias. I would start with a list of questions like, what was I like as a child? Did I have any unusual routines? Did I have any strong interests? What was I like socially? Did I have many friends, etc.? And I will actually leave a list of questions you can ask in the description as well, because I know it's a lot of information to take in at once. It can be quite overwhelming, but basically just questions that can kind of help you build a picture. When you do go for your diagnosis, they will ask you about your childhood and your current life. So you do need to know some of these things. And the next thing I recommend is looking for old evidence. So if you have any school reports, they can be a really helpful tool. If you have learning support records or school books, basically anything that can kind of give you some information about what you were like when you were younger. I would also particularly look out for comments in school reports like they could achieve more if they applied themselves, or things like they're too quiet or they talk too much. They don't participate, they daydream in class, all of these things. And if you have any of that documented, save it because that's really important. And if you don't, that's totally fine. I don't think that everyone is going to have that evidence lying around. And I actually think that it would have been missed in a lot of people because lots of us mask super well. I think that we just know a lot more now than we did 10 years ago. We really didn't have a lot of information back then. And all of these things would have never been picked up on, even our struggles in the classroom and things like that. So if there is no record, that's totally fine. But if you do have that, keep it because your assessment could involve reviewing some of these old documents, or they could involve talking to a family member or someone who knew you when you were a child to gather some of that evidence as well. Another thing that I would recommend you do is start keeping a record. So maybe if you have a little journal and you could just write down anything that you would like to remember for an assessment or you think will be helpful. So basically anything that you're like, oh, that's interesting, I would write it down because it's all evidence, right? So if you're in the supermarket and you notice that you're really overwhelmed by the lights, write that down. If you walk into a room and you forgot why you went in there, write that down. If you were struggling to eat a meal because of the texture, write that down. Basically anything that you can use it as evidence, write it down, but also write down the impact it had, not just what happened. So if you were really overwhelmed in the supermarket by the lights, you could write down that the lights were too bright and you felt like you had to put your sunglasses on and you couldn't concentrate on your shop and you got so overwhelmed that you went home and you forgot half of the things on your list and you had to lock yourself in your room to recover. That's an extreme, that's just one example, but writing down the impact gives you a lot more evidence for your assessment as well. But it also kind of helps you make sense of your experiences too. So it's not totally for the assessment itself. It will also help you understand yourself better. Another thing I'd really think about is how you are in different environments and whether these patterns show up in all of these environments or just one part of your life, like work or home or school, because you might look at yourself at work and be like, oh, I'm fine at work. But then at home, you're a complete mess and you need to lie down in a dark room alone for 3 hours. It's good to look at these things across different environments as well. One of the things that they look for when they do diagnostic assessments is how these symptoms affect your daily life. As I said before, the symptoms need to be present in childhood and in your adult life, as well as occurring in more than one situation. And they need to have an impact on your life. I don't know if any of that makes sense. It is very overwhelming, but that's basically what they look for in diagnosis. Another thing I would do is noticing what you compensate for. So asking yourself, what do you have to work really hard to do that seems effortless for other people? Maybe you have to rehearse conversations before they happen, or you need noise cancelling headphones, or you need your entire day planned in advance. Whatever it is that you do, it's worth asking why you do those things as well. And the last thing is thinking about masking, right? So, this is really relevant when we're talking about autism, especially in women and girls. There is definitely a certain stereotypical portrayal of what autism looks like in the media. And that's actually very different to how autism looks for a lot of people. And that's also worth remembering. But it's important to think about what you do deliberately to navigate social situations or any situation, because masking can make those things a lot less obvious from the outside. And it can actually be really hard when you have grown up and you have just learned to mask subconsciously, because I didn't even know I was doing it for so long. And I'm over a year diagnosed now, and I still pick up moments where I'm masking. So it can be a little bit complex to untangle, but it's important to think about that as well. So, say you've done all of those things and you're like, but Emily, what do I actually do next? So, if you're at the point where you think, okay, I want to pursue an assessment, the first thing I would do is look at how an assessment works where you live. Because I'm based in New Zealand, I'm going to talk about Aotearoa here. If you are somewhere different in the world, I'd recommend looking at how it works in your country, because it does differ from country to country. For ADHD, it's recommended that you start with your GP. You can discuss with them what you've noticed, and they can help refer you onto someone. If they deny your referral, as I said earlier, find another healthcare professional, because not everyone is up to date with current practices, I feel. But as I say, I know that diagnosis is a privilege because it's very expensive. And ADHD has kind of changed in New Zealand recently, and you can get diagnosed through the GP. The other thing that people don't realize is that there is some medication that GPs are now able to prescribe, even if you don't have a formal diagnosis. So it's definitely worth talking to your GP about it, because I know that cost is a barrier for so many people, and there is just virtually no funding to cover that. There are a couple of charities in New Zealand I know that do funding for autism diagnosis, so you can get it cheaper, you can get a loan and then pay it back over time. So all of those things are worth looking up. If you are finding that cost is a barrier, just looking at all the ways that you could possibly make it work, I think is the trick here. So when we think about autism, adult autism assessments typically involved a really detailed assessment by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. They do often involve information from someone you knew when you were younger as well. And aside from the cost, there are also a lot of waiting times as well. So it is worth looking around, because every place is different. But I do know that waiting times do continue to be an issue here. Imagine you've done all that and you are going to pursue your assessment, and you want to know what questions to ask your assessor. And this is something I feel is really, really important as well. I think it's important to ask how much experience they have in assessing adults. If you're a woman, do they have much experience assessing women? Do they have a lot of knowledge around how women portray things differently? And do they have experience around people who mask? I'd say that every assessment is roughly the same, but it could be worth asking how their assessments go, just so you have that predictability beforehand as well. You can ask how many appointments there'll be, what information you need to provide, so you can get all of those things ready prior to your assessment. I think it's also worth asking what happens if they don't reach a diagnosis. Do they diagnose for other things as well? Do you receive a written report? It's also worth asking if they understand the interaction between autism and ADHD, and if they would actually diagnose for both as well, because you really want someone who understands it. If you're spending a lot of money on an assessment, we really want to make sure that we get a good quality assessor who is actually going to get it right. Another thing to be mindful of, because I know going into an assessment kind of feels like you're going in for a test and you want to get the answers right. But I'd say just be yourself and answer honestly. And if you don't know what to say, just be honest and say that. I think your only job going into an assessment is to describe your experience. It's the psychologist or the clinician's job to try and put that information together for you. You don't have to do that part. I was very, very fortunate that my assessor had a really good understanding of women and masking. I was very fortunate because my assessor did not question any part of my experience, and it was just so wonderful and so validating. So I really hope that if you are going down this track, you find someone who is the same. The last thing I just want to address is, what if you go for the assessment and you don't come out with the diagnosis? I think this is something that everyone worries about. I think that's where it's important to ask your assessor beforehand what happens if you don't get a diagnosis and if they will diagnose other conditions, because you may actually come out with a different diagnosis. And at first, I know that if it's not the diagnosis you're expecting, that could be really disappointing. But it's actually really great, because imagine if you were diagnosed wrongly and then you still weren't able to get the support that you needed. So if you're diagnosed with something else, I think that's really positive. But if you do come out of your assessment and you just really feel like they've got it wrong, you can definitely ask for a second opinion. And you can definitely ask your assessor to explain a bit more if you're confused about how they came to that conclusion as well. I know that that's a lot of information and it's probably super overwhelming, but I am going to put whatever information I can in the description of this podcast. I also have some blog posts going up around this as well. You will be able to access the That AuDHD Teacher website as well, with blog posts where you can find all of this. So it all links into each other, which is really cool. And I think it's important to remember that you don't have to go for a diagnosis simply to get the label, right? For me, I went for my diagnosis because I wanted to understand myself better and I wanted to make sense of all my experiences. And that's actually the biggest thing that has come out of my diagnosis as well. I had to explain this to family members who thought that it was just to slap on a label. And I think that's why it's important to think about why you actually want to get the diagnosis. I hear a lot of people say, oh, well, what's the point in an autism assessment because you can't get medicated for it? But for me, it wasn't even about finding a cure or anything like that. It was simply to understand myself. It's been a crazy journey, but I have learned so much, and that's also part of why I'm sharing it now. This whole journey definitely takes time. So don't expect anything to happen fast. You've got lots of time to learn and reflect and do all the things. I hope this has been helpful. And in the next 2 weeks, I actually have a couple of bonus episodes where I take this a step further, because I've actually kept some of my assessment paperwork. So in episode 11, I'm going to be going through some of the actual ADHD screening questionnaires I completed as part of my assessment, and I'll show you what some of the questions that were asked, talk through how I answered them, and explain what that experience was like for me. And then in episode 12, I'm going to do the same thing, but looking at my autism assessment. So if you're interested in what an actual adult AuDHD assessment can look like from the perspective of someone who's actually been through one, definitely stick around for those. But thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope this episode has been useful. If you're at the stage of wondering whether autism or ADHD might explain some of your experiences, and if today's episode resonated with you, I'd love it if you followed That AuDHD Teacher on whatever podcast platform you listen on. And if you have a moment to leave a rating or a review, it really does help other people discover these conversations. You can also find me on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Threads at That AuDHD Teacher. I have a WordPress blog called That AuDHD Teacher as well. But until next time, remember that different doesn't mean broken, it simply means different. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode.